Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the most terrible kings ever to sit upon thrones in medieval times. Rulers whose cruelty, folly, or weakness carved scars into the souls of kingdoms. Some lost battles, others lost the trust of their people. Some ruled with iron fists, while others simply let the world unravel around them. But all left behind bitter echoes in the chronicles of men. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honor, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. Number 1. King John of England. Number 1. King John of England, Bad King John. I walked England's roads when John's banner still clung to the wind, and never did I hear a king curse so often beneath breath. His father, Henry II, had forged law and dominion, and his brother Richard shone in war like burnished steel. But John ruled with greed for a heart and suspicion for a mind. He lost Normandy to Philip of France, not with a cry of battle, but through cowardice and blunder. I saw men weep not for the land, but for the shame it brought. He taxed us like a man bleeding a stone, demanding coin for wars he dared not fight, and for castles he could not keep. Scutage, they called it, a fee to avoid military service, but it bled the barons dry. Merchants shuttered their shops, fearing the knock of the king's sheriffs. Even the church turned against him. When he quarrelled with Pope Innocent III, England lay excommunicated, and no bell rang for the dead. The land grew hushed with dread. Justice in John's court was sold to the highest bidder. I remember a good man, Osric, a reeve from Lincolnshire, who lost his land because he could not outbid a rival with deeper purses. John jailed those who defied him, sometimes without trial, and often without return. His whims were law, and his cruelty quiet. But such quiet cruelty corrodes a kingdom faster than fire. By 1215, even the lords of England had had their fill. I stood at Runnymede when they forced his seal upon parchment, the Magna Carta. It was no joyous day, only weary men demanding limits to a king who had none. They asked not for riches or reward, but for law to bind the crown. And still, John broke his word within weeks, as easily as snapping a dry twig. That was the moment I knew rebellion would come. The land tore itself in two, with barons seeking aid from Prince Louis of France. Foreign banners flew over Kent and London, and civil war spilled through our fields. John, ever the coward, fled from battle and clung to the shadows. I heard he laughed as he plundered church treasuries to fund his cause, but there was no joy in that sound, only desperation. They say he died of dysentery, gorging on peaches and cider in Newark. But I think it was the weight of betrayal that sickened him. Even death showed him no dignity. His body was rushed into Worcester Cathedral by monks more loyal to God than crown, and no one wept. The road that bore his funeral was lined not with mourners, but with silence. When I speak of John, I remember the look on a peasant's face as soldiers took his only cow for the king's levy, or the hollow-eyed scribe who swore he'd copied so many royal writs he could feel ink in his veins instead of blood. John never ruled. He extracted. He never built. He bled. In him, the crown became a noose for the realm, and yet, from his tyranny, a seed of liberty was sown. Magna Carta did not heal the wound, but it became a scar that taught kings to fear the judgment of their people. In his failure, John accomplished more than he ever did in power. Strange, isn't it? How even a terrible king can unwittingly birth something greater than himself. Number 2. Ethelred II, the Unready. I was but a boy when tales of Ethelred reached my village, passed in grim whispers beside hearths. They called him unread, not unprepared, as many now think, but ill-advised. a king led by frightened men with silver tongues and no iron in their spines. The Northmen had returned by sea, not as traders but as wolves, and England needed a hunter, not a lamb. Yet Ethelred sent coins instead of courage. He paid them Danegeld, sums so vast that churches melted their candlesticks and townsfolk sold their kin into bondage. And still the longships came, sails thick on the horizon like storm clouds with teeth. I met a monk who said the silver we gave to save us only sharpened their swords. The more we offered, the more they demanded. The more we feared, the more they returned. His court was a theatre of whispers. Nobles jockeyed for power while villages burned. One day, Ethelred was advised to fight, the next to flee. Loyalty meant little, and justice even less. At times he fled his own capital, leaving London to its fate. I remember the sick feeling in my gut the first time I heard Winchester had fallen. It felt like a hearth had gone cold in the heart of the kingdom. Then came the massacre. St. Brice's Day, 1002. Ethelred, in a flash of rash resolve, ordered the killing of all Danes in England. Men, women, children, those who had dwelled among us for years, were suddenly slaughtered in the name of vengeance. I saw none of it with my eyes, but I have spoken to those who did, and their voices still crack from the memory. Blood was met with blood, as it always is. King Swine Forkbeard came to answer the carnage with fire and steel. His wrath was not swift but thunderous. Whole shires vanished into ash. The Danes no longer sought tribute, they sought dominion. Ethelred had invited the storm, and when it broke upon us, he had no shelter to offer. He fled to Normandy like a beggar in royal robes. When he returned years later, it was not to lead, but to endure. The land had been torn open, and men trusted their own blades more than the king's word. Even his death in 1016 brought no relief, only more war, more claimants, more ruin. He left a realm not fallen, but adrift. It is a terrible thing to see a land forget what it once was. The priest would say Ethelred's soul needed prayer, not judgment, but in the alleys and fields, among the common folk, his name was spoken with scorn, not for evil, but for absence, for the silence when a voice was most needed, for the hesitation when action could have saved lives. That silence echoed louder than any horn of war. Now, when I pass through old villages where churches lean and names fade, I sometimes wonder what they might have become had he stood firm. Perhaps England would have bled regardless. But to bleed with honour is one thing. To bleed because your captain abandoned the helm, that is another wound entirely. Number 3. King Stephen. I remember the year Stephen took the crown, not with triumph, but with tension thick as frost. The old king, Henry III, had lost his only son to the sea, and though his daughter Matilda had been named heir, many nobles feared the thought of a woman ruling alone. So Stephen moved swiftly, seizing the treasury and earning the church's favour. But what he gained in speed, he lacked in strength. The kingdom was not his by right, and all knew it. Soon, power split like rotted timber. Matilda refused to yield, and her allies rose like fire through the counties. Castles not built for glory but for siege sprouted like thorns across the land. I passed towns where two rival strongholds stared each other down across a river, both flying banners, both starving their neighbours. The people called it the anarchy, and truly, it felt as if order itself had fled. No law held in those years. Lords took what they pleased, and their men raped and robbed with impunity. Fields went unplanted for fear of plunder. Churches were looted by knights meant to defend them. I watched mothers bury sons not fallen in battle, but cut down by hungry mercenaries. When winter came, it brought not stillness, but howls of men who had once been farmers, now turned wolves. Stephen himself was no villain, but he was no rock either. Captured once in battle, traded like a piece on a board, he He ruled from thrones that shook with every whisper of rebellion. One moment, he pardoned enemies. The next, he forgot his word. Trust frayed until it was no longer cloth, but threadbare string. Even the noblest knight could not tell whom to follow. When Matilda briefly seized London, the city rose against her in fury. I was there when her carriage fled through narrow lanes, pelted with dung and stone. She held the crown for but a moment before it slipped away again. The land groaned beneath the weight of two rulers, and neither could lift it. The struggle was not of good versus evil, but of claim versus claim, each flawed, each insistent. The monks wrote, "Christ and his saints slept, and I believe them. I had never seen so many altar candles snuffed out, so many holy relics stolen to buy food or favour. The dead were left unblessed, the living unled. Children born during those years grew to manhood without knowing peace, and old men died before remembering it. The very rhythm of life was shattered. Only when Stephen's son died did the war begin to fade. With no heir to claim the future, Stephen named Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, as his successor. That simple act, so late, ended 19 years of ruin. I was at Winchester when Henry knelt before the weary king, and in that silence, it felt as if the land finally exhaled. The worst tragedies, I've learned, come not from evil intent, but from the crumbling of duty. Stephen was no butcher, no tyrant, but he was weak, and weakness atop a throne can be more ruinous than cruelty. There were no victors in that war, only survivors, and the ghosts of what might have been. Number 4, King Edward II. There was a strangeness about Edward the moment he wore the crown, as if the weight of it never quite sat right upon his brow. He was the son of a warrior king, yet seemed more drawn to pageantry than politics, to laughter in private chambers rather than counsel at court. I once saw him ride beside Piers Gaveston, not like a monarch with his knight, but like a man with his mirror. Gaveston, bold and flamboyant, wielded more sway than any lord should dare, and that imbalance poisoned everything it touched. Nobles muttered in great halls and plotted in dark corners. They resented how the king's affection translated into gifts, lands, and titles, all tossed to Gaveston as if loyalty and law had no price. Edward dismissed them with a wave, believing charm could command respect. But England was not in a forgiving mood. Gaveston was exiled, then returned, and finally captured and slain. I passed the field where they found his body, headless and discarded like refuse, and even then Edward did not learn. Then came Scotland. Bannockburn in 1314 remains a scar, deep and weeping. I fought there, saw English pride trampled beneath the hooves of Bruce's cavalry. Edward led us poorly, lost in chaos, and fled the field when he should have stood. The shame of that day echoed across every shire. Afterward, the Scots raided freely, and the border folk lived behind burned doors and broken walls. Courage was demanded, and he offered confusion. In time, new favourites took Gaveston's place. The Despensers, father and son, cunning and cold. They whispered in Edward's ear while land was seized and enemies imprisoned. Justice became a mask worn only when it suited the crown. Common folk told tales of men jailed without trial, of daughters taken, and of taxes squeezed until bone showed beneath the skin. The barons rose again, and again the land was torn by treachery and war. What unsettled many most was his queen, Isabella of France. She had come as a bride in splendour, and left as an avenger in iron. I remember the day she returned with Mortimer, her lover and ally, banners unfurling on English soil. Cities opened their gates without resistance. The people had no love left for Edward, only exhaustion. Even his household knights lowered their blades without protest. He was captured and imprisoned, forced to yield his crown to his son. I heard the wind howling that night, as if mourning a passing no one would name. Some say his death at Berkeley Castle was merciful. Others whisper of horrors, too cruel to speak aloud. I do not know the truth, only that no light returned from that place, and no justice followed. His fall was quiet but final. Years later, I visited the ruins of one of his favored retreats. Vines grew through shattered arches, and birds nested in rafters that once rang with laughter. There was no plaque, no tribute, only silence and the sigh of leaves in wind. It struck me then how power, once lost, leaves no trace but decay. Memory is cruel in that way. Edward's story is not one of tyranny, but of blindness. A man who confused indulgence for loyalty, affection for strength. He did not build cruelty, but neither did he break it. And so he was broken, not by one hand, but by the slow turning of many hearts away. In the end, even a crown cannot protect a man from being forgotten. Number 5. King Richard II. When Richard came to the throne, he was barely more than a child, and England was weary from plague, war, and unrest. I remember the whispers then. Some hoped his youth might bring gentleness after years of hardship. But gentle hands can still close into fists. In 1381, when the Commons rose in fury, Richard rode out to meet them, unguarded. He spoke with calm, promised reforms, and for a fleeting breath, the rebellion faded. Yet the promises were lies, and the price of trust was paid in blood. Wat Tyler, their leader, was struck down during parley, and the king stood unmoved as the slaughter began. I saw corpses piled in Smithfield, farmers, apprentices, even priests, all silenced for daring to hope. After that day, Richard changed. The boy king who once soothed fears became a monarch of suspicion and pride. He began to rule alone, casting aside counsellors and punishing any who dared question his divine right. He banished rivals without cause, stripped nobles of titles, and emptied coffers to fund his luxuries. His court became a mirror of his vanity, gilded, perfumed, detached from the hunger beyond palace walls. Forced loans bled merchants, and harsh levies stirred the embers of revolt once more. I walked through towns where markets had gone silent, for none could afford to trade. Even nature seemed to hold its breath beneath his rule. The Lords Appellant rose in resistance, led by Gloucester, Warwick, and Arundel. For a time they triumphed, capturing Richard's favourites and forcing the king to bend. But he did not forget. A decade later, with power regained, he repaid the insult tenfold. Trials without jury, executions without mercy, Arundel beheaded, Gloucester smothered abroad. He smiled through it all, as if history itself would bow to him. He believed his crown was above question, his will above law. I heard him speak once in Westminster, declaring himself chosen by God, untouchable by Parliament or peer. It was not majesty, it was madness in golden robes. The people grew quiet again, but this time it was not out of fear. It was out of waiting. Waiting for the moment a braver man would stand. That man was Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt. Exiled by Richard, he returned when the king seized his lands. Armies followed not out of love for Henry, but out of hate for Richard. The king fled, then surrendered without a blow. I saw him pass through London in plain garb, head bowed beneath jeers and stones. He was no longer a ruler, only a reminder. They imprisoned him in Pontefract Castle, where winter gnawed through the stone and the guards grew silent. Some say he starved, others say he was murdered. The truth was buried with him. But I know this. His fall was not tragic, for it was earned. His cruelty was not thunderous but cold, precise, and dressed in velvet. And when he died, the land felt lighter. Richard taught me that a king may wield power through terror, but terror cannot bind hearts forever. Those who rule through fear walk on ice, thin and glistening, and when it breaks, they fall alone, with none to mourn, and no songs to preserve their name. Number 6, King Henry VI. The day they crowned him, he was too small to hold a sword, too quiet to speak for himself. They placed the crown upon his infant head, and for a moment the realm dreamed of peace. But peace is not born from innocence alone. While his father's shadow lingered in France, the boy grew into a man more suited for prayer than for war. I saw him once, kneeling in silence for hours as the affairs of the realm collapsed around him like a burning church. He meant no harm, that much I believe. But harm followed him like a hound to a lame master. Without firm hand or voice, barons grew bolder, and England's enemies found courage anew. In France, lands won through years of blood were lost in a breath. Normandy, Gascony, Anjou, all fell as Henry offered only tears and scripture. Soldiers returned with hollow eyes, their pay denied, and their cause forgotten. Twice he slipped into spells, where the world vanished from his gaze. He would sit unmoving for days, his lips sealed, as if stitched by unseen hands. I watched nobles pass him by in court, speaking of war, of marriages, of land, as if he were already a monument. His mind, it seemed, was a garden overrun, and no one left to tend it. Yet still, he wore the crown, and the storm gathered around it. When Margaret of Anjou became his queen, she ruled in all but name, fierce and proud. She fought for their son's inheritance with the fire Henry lacked. But fire breeds fire. The lords of York rose in fury, claiming the throne through bloodlines and betrayal. The Wars of the Roses were not wars in name only. They soaked our soil with brotherhood undone. I buried comrades beneath hedgerows and saw banners fly over fields that once knew only wheat. Henry fled more than he fought. Captured, released, imprisoned again. He drifted through castles like a ghost in royal flesh. One winter, I passed the Tower of London and heard rumours that he sang to himself in the night, lullabies for a world that no longer listened. His enemies ruled in his name, then overthrew him in turn. The crown passed between heads like a coin flipped by fate. His son, young Edward, perished in battle, his corpse trampled and cold before Henry knew. And when that news came, so too did the end. He was found lifeless in the tower, blood staining the chapel stones where he had once knelt. Some say it was a dagger, others a broken heart. But in truth, his end had come long before. A king in name, but never in command. I still remember his seal, delicate, pious, etched with saints and lilies. It felt more like a monk's prayer than a sovereign's decree. In the villages, they speak kindly of him even now, as if goodness alone could excuse the ruin. But goodness without strength is a lantern in the wind, gentle light, quickly lost. There was no joy in Henry's reign, only sorrow stretched over decades. He did not wage tyranny, but invited chaos through absence, and in the silence of his rule, louder men tore England apart. I pity him still, yet pity cannot bind a kingdom, nor heal the wounds his weakness left behind. Number 7, King Richard III. The wind smelled of iron the day Richard claimed the throne, and many muttered that fate itself recoiled. He was no stranger to power, but the way he reached for it chilled even seasoned knights. Edward IV had died, leaving sons too young to rule. Richard, their uncle, took them under his protection, and then the world went silent behind the walls of the tower. I never saw the boys again, nor did anyone who lived to tell it. They vanished like morning mist, and in their absence, Richard was crowned. Some cheered, many watched in unease. His laws were clever, his speech precise, but there was always a shadow behind his eyes. I sat in Parliament once as his justiciars spoke of reforms. The words were fair, but they rang hollow, like prayer in a cathedral emptied by plague. Truth is, even when he did right, no one trusted it. He moved swiftly against those who doubted him. Rivers and Grey executed. Hastings cut down without trial. Lands seized, titles erased. In the north, men bowed low but gripped their hilts. Even among allies, there lingered the scent of fear. It was said Richard heard plots in every whisper, saw treason in every glance. I believe he saw ghosts in mirrors, not only of boys, but of loyalty undone. His enemies gathered beyond the channel, and soon the tides turned. Henry Tudor, a distant claimant with more ambition than bloodline, crossed with foreign gold and Welsh banners. I marched with Richard to Bosworth, though my faith had dimmed. That morning, as the sun rose red, I saw the king mount his horse in full plate, eyes burning not with courage, but desperation. A man who knew his throne rested on bones. The battle was swift and strange. Stanley held back his men, watching like a crow. Richard charged at Henry with fury, cutting through the melee like a man possessed. But numbers betrayed him. He was struck down in mud and steel, surrounded, abandoned. His crown was found in a hawthorn bush, a cruel crown for a king who had never been truly seated. I passed his naked corpse, slung over a horse like a sack of grain. Arrow wounds marked his back, and his face was twisted, more in sorrow than rage. There was no honor in his end, only finality. He died as he lived, fighting shadows, chasing control. The Plantagenets fell with him, and a new age took root, one that buried his memory beneath Tudor ink. In taverns, he became a monster, thanks to poets and playwrights. Hunchback, murderer, devil. These names became his tombstone. Yet I recall a man more tragic than tyrant, too clever for comfort, too ruthless for love. His sins were real, but so too was the burden he bore in a world that forgave neither weakness nor ambition. Richard reminds me that power seized in haste rarely holds. A throne built on missing heirs and silent rooms cannot endure the storm. He ruled with precision, but not with trust, and when the wind rose, not even iron could keep him standing. Number 8. King Philip IV, the Iron King. The court of France under Philip felt more like a forge than a palace, rigid, cold, efficient. He was not a man of laughter or pageantry, but of ledgers and law. I saw him once, mounted in silence, his gaze fixed forward as if measuring the world for conquest. His rule brought order, yes, but the kind that crushes as it cleans. France grew stronger, but the souls within it trembled, even when they cheered. His wars bled the treasury dry. Against England, against Flanders, always another campaign, another levy. When coin failed him, he turned on his own. Jews were expelled in a tide of grief and broken homes, their wealth seized by royal decree. I remember them marching, children clutching heirlooms while guards looked on unmoved. It was not hatred that drove it. It was calculation. Gold weighs more than loyalty in a king's hand. Even the Pope was not beyond his reach. Boniface VIII had resisted royal taxation, and for that defiance, Philip answered with fury. The Pope was seized, humiliated, and though released, he never recovered. Rome remembered. The papacy soon fled to Avignon. Its spine bowed. It was the first time I realized a king could wound not just men, but faith itself. Philip had turned the church into another tool. But what haunts me still is what he did to the Templars. In 1307, on a morning chilled with mist, they were arrested across France, every last one. I stood outside the temple in Paris as knights were dragged out in chains, eyes dazed with disbelief. They were accused of blasphemy, heresy, vile rituals. Yet no proof came, only torture and confessions drawn from broken bodies. It was not justice. It was theft masked in piety. Jacques de Molay, their Grand Master, burned at the stake before Notre Dame, flames licking skyward as he cursed Philip with his final breath. Some say the king died not long after, and his line unravelled soon thereafter. But curses need not be true to take root. They only need memory. The people remembered. I remember. A chill passed through France that no crown could warm. Yet even with all his iron, Philip did forge a monarchy less beholden to nobles, more centralized, more feared. The gears of governance turned tighter, cleaner, crueler. But at what cost? The Templars had guarded the Holy Land, protected pilgrims, built hospitals. Now they were ash in the wind, sacrificed for royal debt. It taught us that no virtue is safe from the hunger of kings. His subjects dared not rebel, yet they did not love him. I heard merchants mutter prayers against his taxes, and priests flinch at his name. He ruled by fear dressed as law, and law bent beneath his will like softened steel. I served under many kings, but none made me question the meaning of duty more than Philip. They called him the Iron King, and rightly so. He did not bend, did not bleed, did not falter, but neither did he listen, nor forgive. And when the weight of his own deeds bore down, even iron cracked. His reign reminds me that strength without mercy leaves not legacy, but silence. Number 9, King John II of France. I was already a seasoned rider when John of France fell at Poitiers, and still I recall the sick crack of hooves in mud and the glint of English arrows cutting down knights like wheat. He fought bravely, they say, and I do not doubt it. He was taken in full armour, sword in hand. But valour in chains brings no comfort to a starving realm. While John was paraded across the Channel, France bled without him. Captured by the Black Prince in 1356, he became less a king and more a prize. He lived in English luxury while his kingdom withered under the weight of ransom. Taxes swelled beyond reason. The coin debased. Crops taken from peasants before harvest could even reach the ground. I saw entire families flee their farms, not from war, but from their own king's collectors. There is no mercy in a debt owed by a crown. To raise the king's price, France squeezed its veins dry. Nobles extorted towns, brigands roamed the countryside, and trust in royal justice shattered like a church window struck by stone. In Paris, the streets boiled with discontent. The people no longer saw a monarch in exile. They saw betrayal wrapped in silk. I watched the flames of revolt lick the night sky, and still John remained abroad, playing host in foreign courts. Then came the Jacquerie. Peasants, maddened by hunger and humiliation, rose with scythes and axes. Their fury was not clean. It burned through manor and abbey alike. Though they were crushed, their cries did not vanish. I passed the charred remnants of a village in Beauvais, and there on the soot-black wall, someone had scratched with a blade, "We are not beasts." That message has stayed with me. John returned to France, briefly, and then left again, voluntarily, when his son failed to uphold the ransom terms. Some hailed it as honour. Others saw only abandonment. I saw a broken man retreating to the only place that still gave him comfort, his captor's court. France, meanwhile, was left in hands that could not close the wounds. A king's duty is to remain, but John chose dignity over presence, and his people paid. When he finally died in 1364, it was not with the peace of a ruler, but with the weight of failure pressing his chest. The land he left behind was weakened, divided, doubting itself. His reign had shown that even a noble heart can bring ruin if led by pride and folly. He had fought like a knight, but ruled like a debtor. There are tapestries that still show him seated beside English lords, dressed in rich blues and golds, smiling gently. But those images lie. Behind every thread is a peasant's hunger, a soldier's unpaid sword, a widow's tax. That is what his ransom truly cost. Not coin, but faith. And once a people lose faith, they do not easily reclaim it. When I think of John, I think not of Poitiers or his chivalry, but of the silence that followed his choices. In that silence, wolves grew bold and hope grew thin. A king need not be cruel to be terrible. Sometimes, all it takes is absence, dressed in honour. Number 10, King Charles VI, the Mad. There was a time, brief and flickering, when Charles rode through Paris as a golden sun, young, gallant, beloved. But that brightness dimmed far too soon. I saw it with my own eyes, the moment his gaze turned inward, lost in shadows that no one else could see. One summer day in 1392, he lashed out at his own men with drawn sword, crying they were traitors. When he awoke, he remembered nothing. From that moment on, France was ruled not by a man, but by a storm inside him. He would forget who he was, who his wife was, who ruled beside him. He thought himself made of glass, begged his servants not to touch him. At court, silence replaced laughter, and careful steps replaced counsel. I passed courtiers in whisper, praying the king would be lucid that day, lest their fortunes rise or fall on the tide of his mind. It was not evil that ruled us. It was chaos in royal flesh. When he was well, Charles could charm a court with soft words and grace, but those moments were rare and unreliable, like spring frost. Power slipped from his hands into the arms of feuding dukes, Orléans, Burgundy, and later the Armagnacs. I watched banners change in Paris almost as often as the seasons. One day you bowed to Orléans, the next to Burgundy, and always the people paid the price. Then came the Bal des Ardents, an ill-starred masquerade where men danced in costumes of pitch and flax. A torch strayed too close, and fire engulfed the revelers. The king survived barely, but others burned to death screaming as music continued. I still hear those cries in sleep. It was not just a tragedy, it was a sign. The court was mad as its monarch, all jest and death entwined. Henry V of England saw the weakness and struck. France, divided and leaderless, could not resist. The fields of Agincourt ran red, and still Charles sat in Paris, mumbling to saints no one else could see. His queen, Isabeau, signed the Treaty of Troyes, disinheriting their son in favour of England's king. The Dauphin fled, and France itself seemed to splinter like a sword dropped in frost. The people did not riot, they despaired. A mad king is not like a cruel one. There is no resistance, only confusion. Who do you fight when the crown weeps and forgets your name? I saw farmers abandon the land, nobles retreat into towers, priests weep in pulpits. Madness became a fog that choked every corner of the realm. When Charles died in 1422, no bells rang in mourning. The nation was too fractured, too exhausted. His son returned to claim what was left, but the scars ran deep. I looked into the eyes of soldiers who had known no other king, and they held nothing but emptiness. France had survived, but not unbroken. Charles left behind no empire, no reforms, no glories. Only the memory of a crown worn by a man adrift in his own mind. His story is a reminder that not all ruin comes with fire and blade. Some comes quietly, as a mind unraveling in candlelight, while the world watches and cannot look away. Number 11, King Charles II of Navarre, the Bad. His nickname was not given in jest. It was earned, slowly, like rust on a blade. Charles of Navarre was born to land and title, a prince of many claims, but loyalty was never among them. I met him once in Rouen, and his eyes were colder than any winter I've known. He smiled like a man who already knew your secrets. In the game of kings, he played with poison on the board. France, torn by factions, offered him endless chances to betray. One year he allied with the English, the next with the French, always calculating which side would profit him most. He made promises with the ease of breathing and broke them with less thought. His enemies vanished mysteriously or fell ill with haste. Some said his kitchens held more than spices. I never ate at his table. He was accused of murdering the Constable of France in cold blood, then denying it as easily as dusting his sleeve. Kings may kill on the battlefield, but Charles preferred shadows. He trafficked in letters and secrets, and the dead followed him like a procession. During the 100 Years' War, he dragged the conflict deeper into the dirt, prolonging every misery with his schemes. Navarre itself suffered under his rule, though few dared speak it aloud. Taxes climbed, prisons swelled, and trust rotted at the roots. I rode through villages where no one would say his name aloud. They feared not just the king, but what the king knew. His spies sat in taverns and chapels, ears open, knives ready. Even priests looked over their shoulders during sermons. When peace seemed possible, Charles stirred the embers. A treaty here, a betrayal there. He kept war alive like a man tending a sick fire. He did not want victory, He wanted leverage. Always waiting, always watching. I once heard a duke say, "Charles fights with other men's swords and drinks with other men's blood." It was not exaggeration. It was bitter truth. His death was as strange as his life. Some say he was wrapped in brandy-soaked cloth for a treatment, and a careless servant set him alight. Others whisper darker things, that his end was punishment long delayed. I was far from Navarre when the news came, but even then, I noticed how many nobles raised their cups without sorrow. Fear had outlived the man. His legacy was not carved in stone, but etched in suspicion. The war he fed continued long after, and the seeds he sowed in treachery bore fruit in every broken treaty that followed. Even generations later, his name meant danger, whispered like a curse. I once heard a mother warn her child, "Lie again, and Charles the Bad will come for you." And the child wept. I have seen many kinds of power, strength, wisdom, even kindness. But the power of Charles was venom, slow and spreading. He ruled with guile, and died with no one to mourn him. A terrible king does not need to be loud. Sometimes the worst are those who smile as they twist the blade and vanish into the night. Number 12. King Louis the Paville. The universal spider. He did not look like a king. Thin, pale, always dressed in plain garments with a tattered felt hat pulled low. But beneath that modest cloth spun a mind as sharp and intricate as any blade. Louis wove networks of spies across France like a spider builds its web, silent, watchful, lethal. I saw men bow to him with trembling knees, unsure whether they'd leave court with honors or in chains. He dismantled the great feudal houses not by war, but by waiting. Promises made, then broken. Rebels forgiven, then arrested. He preferred to trap his enemies in their own ambitions, letting them stumble while he pulled the string. The Duke of Nemours learned this too late, executed, despite oaths and offers. I heard the executioner had to strike more than once. Some said Louis listened from behind a curtain. Iron cages were his favorite prison, too small to stand, too narrow to lie down. Some spent years in them, slowly forgetting what it meant to move freely. I rode past Loches once and saw one of these devices lowered from a window like a cruel bell. Even the wind avoided that tower. Louis needed no battlefield. He ruled through silence, black ink, and whispered threats. He brought order, yes, and reigned in the chaos left by the 100 Years' War. Roads became safer, laws more consistent, the crown stronger. But it came with a price. Merchants prospered while nobles disappeared. Parish priests praised peace, but feared his scribes more than the devil. Justice arrived, but often too late and with too much force. France did not smile, it held its breath. The church found itself cornered. Bishops who resisted were removed, and papal decrees went unread if they displeased the king. He even allied with the Swiss, the Burgundians, the very enemies of France, when it suited him. Loyalty meant nothing. Results were all. I once heard a friar say, "Louis has no soul, only plans." It was meant in hushed jest, but the man vanished soon after. He outlived most of his enemies, watched them crumble, one by one, until his web stretched from the Pyrenees to the northern frontiers. And yet, in his final years, he hid in a fortified manor at Plessis-les-Tours, terrified of death. Surrounded by relics, astrologers and leeches, he trusted no one. Not his doctors, not his children, not even God. I heard he kept the doors locked at all hours. When he finally died in 1483, there was no weeping in the streets, only a long, cautious exhale. His son, Charles VIII, inherited a throne unchallenged, yet watched closely. Louis had secured the monarchy, but not affection. He gave France structure, but not warmth. His was a reign respected, never loved. I often think of the spider, patient, still, and always watching. Louis ruled not through strength of arms or beauty of speech, but through fear of what he might know and what he might do. In that way, he was more than a king. He was a shadow that lingered long after the crown passed on. Number 13, King Peter the Fern of Castile, the Cruel. He ruled with eyes like chipped stone, hard, fixed, unmoved by pleas or prayers. I stood in Seville when his banners flew high above the Alcazar, and already the city whispered of blood behind its walls. Peter was not a madman, but he made terror his throne. He trusted few, betrayed many, and punished swiftly. Nobles fell as often as leaves in autumn, each one replaced by a sharper tool in his grasp. His own half-brothers were not spared. Fadrique was summoned with promises of peace, then slain in cold blood. The hall where it happened still echoes, or so they say. I met a servant who swore the tiles beneath his feet were scrubbed daily and still would not come clean. Peter's rage was not blind, it was deliberate. To cross him was to vanish, sometimes in daylight, sometimes in sleep. His wife, Blanche of Bourbon, lived barely a few days beside him before being cast aside, imprisoned, and eventually killed. No ceremony, no confession, only silence. He favored a mistress instead, Maria de Padilla, whose influence waxed like a second crown. And yet even she could not soften him. I watched as entire families were condemned for the crimes of one, their estates taken, their names buried. War followed war, against Aragon, against Portugal, against his own barons. Peter bled Castile not for conquest, but for control. His court became a place of sharp smiles and sharper daggers. Messengers trembled before delivering ill news. I saw one hanged for arriving late after a siege. No apology could mend delay in a realm where time was measured in executions. Yet he was no fool. Jews and Muslims found protection under his rule, so long as they served his ends. This earned him allies in unlikely places and enemies among the nobility, who called him heretic as easily as tyrant. But Peter cared little for labels. He wielded fear like a blacksmith's hammer, and forged silence across 3 kingdoms. Eventually, his enemies grew bolder. His own kin, Henry of Trastamara, returned with French troops and papal blessing. The kingdom split like dry wood. I remember the Battle of Montiel, dust and screams and steel. Peter was captured in a ruse, led into a tent where he faced the half-brother he had hunted. They say the duel was short. A dagger to the face ended it all. When the dust settled, many rejoiced. But the stain of his rule did not fade so quickly. The palace he filled with screams still stood. The roads paved with confiscated wealth remained. Justice came, but it came too late. And for those who had lived beneath his shadow, peace felt more like a question than a gift. I once passed through Toledo, and an old mason there said, "He built high walls but no bridges." That is how I remember Peter, not for his victories, but for the fear he left behind. A ruler who loved no one, not even his crown, and ruled not by grace, but by the knife. Number 14. King Enrique IV of Castile, the impotent. There are crowns that shine with power, and others that crumble beneath the weight of laughter. Enrique's was the latter. I watched his court unravel like a poorly stitched cloak. Nobles sneering behind fans, rumors drifting like smoke through the halls. They said he could not father a child. They said worse. And in Castile, a king mocked is a king already half fallen. Authority seeps away not only through weakness, but through ridicule that refuses to die. He granted favors with a loose hand, raised low-born companions to high office, and filled his council with flatterers. The nobles, proud and sharp-toothed, would not stand for it. They turned his generosity into a blade against him, whispering that his daughter, Juana, was not his at all. They called her La Beltraneja, hinting she was born of another man's seed. The insult grew into sedition. I passed through Segovia when the nobles staged a mock trial. They erected a wooden effigy of the king on a throne, then toppled it in ceremony. It was not war, but worse, a public stripping of dignity. After that, rebellion bloomed like rot. The land was no longer his to command, only to plead with. A king who begs no longer wears a crown, but a mask of shame. Castile split in two, uncertain whether to follow Enrique or those who claimed his reign void. Civil war crackled, not with great battles, but with shifting loyalties, sieges, and broken promises. He tried to hold the center, but the center would not hold him. I saw cities change allegiance overnight. Farmers who had once paid their taxes in peace now paid twice, to both sides, and starved anyway. He sought refuge in showings of piety, surrounding himself with monks and mystics. But no saint could cleanse the stain cast by gossip. The people mocked his processions and turned blessings into jeers. Even the churches could not agree whether his daughter had the right to inherit. When God's voice is split by politics, faith falters beneath banners, not above them. His final years were hollow. He wandered from one castle to another, unwelcome in the very kingdom he ruled. His sister Isabella grew in power, and with her, the future took root elsewhere. I remember hearing his death announced in a market square. Few paused, fewer prayed. The wind carried his name away like dust across stone. What remained after him was a throne tainted with uncertainty. His daughter's claim led to war, his name to mockery. Yet in truth, it was not evil that ruined Enrique. It was doubt. Doubt that crept into every chamber, every document, every oath. And once doubt touches a crown, it never fully washes out. Some kings are feared, some are followed, and some are forgotten. Enrique was none of these. He was remembered not for what he did, but for what he failed to prove. And in a world where bloodlines shape nations, that failure echoed louder than any decree he ever made. Number 15. King Charles I of Anjou. He came to Italy with papal blessing and a sword sharpened not just for battle, but for dominion. Charles, brother to the King of France, moved like a man certain the world owed him a throne. He crushed Manfred of Hohenstaufen at Benevento, his enemies scattered, and the crown of Naples placed upon his brow. But conquest is not the same as rule. I walked the streets of Palermo after his victory, and already resentment festered behind drawn shutters. His rule weighed heavily on Sicily. Taxes rose, foreign soldiers filled the garrisons, and French officials replaced local voices. Justice was no longer spoken in the tongue of the people, but dictated in the stiff French of foreign lords. I saw merchants turned beggars, and farmers conscripted to wars far from home. His court glittered in Naples, but in the villages the glow never reached, only the cold demands of a distant crown. When Conradin, the last Hohenstaufen heir, rode to reclaim his birthright, the people dared to hope. But Charles was swift and merciless. I watched Conradin, barely 16, kneel before the block in Naples. The boy's blonde hair blew gently in the sea breeze before the axe fell. No crowd cheered, only silence. And from that silence, fury began to grow. Sicilian hearts turned inward, bitter and waiting. Then came the spark, the Sicilian Vespers. A single insult, a single death, and suddenly bells rang not for prayer, but for blood. The island exploded in revolt, French soldiers slaughtered in streets and fields, their bodies thrown to the sea. I rode through the smoke of Messina and saw banners made from cloaks soaked in blood. It was not a rebellion, it was vengeance. Charles tried to retake the island, but Sicily would not yield. The Aragonese arrived, welcomed not as conquerors, but as avengers. Years of war followed, and Charles poured fortune and men into the sea, chasing a crown that had turned to ash. His gaze, once so assured, began to flicker with desperation. A throne once claimed by papal decree now mocked him from across a narrow strait. Even in defeat, he did not relent. He plotted, schemed, raised new armies. But fortune had turned, and the sword he once wielded with confidence now shook in his grasp. I saw him, in his final years, swollen with age and ambition, still dreaming of reconquest. There is something tragic in a man who never understands when he has already lost. He died in 1285, leaving his son to inherit the struggle. But the kingdom he forged through blood never held its shape. Naples remained his, but Sicily was lost, and with it, his legacy. The popes who had once crowned him now hesitated. The people who had once feared him now spat upon his name. Even his tomb was built in haste, more stone than reverence. Charles taught me that crowns gained by iron must be held by justice, or they will slip through the fingers no matter how tightly clenched. He ruled with the certainty of divine right, but forgot the weight of human hearts. And in forgetting that, he lost everything that made kingship more than conquest. Number 16. King Christian II of Denmark. He came to Sweden under banners of unity, but he brought fear in the folds of his cloak. Christian dreamed of binding the three northern crowns under his will: Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Yet what he offered was not union, but submission. I stood among the crowd in Stockholm in 1520, as nobles bent their knees and accepted his coronation. They did not trust him, but they feared worse. A peace built on trembling shoulders cannot stand for long. 3 days later, the knives came out. Under the guise of celebration, Christian summoned his enemies to a feast, then arrested them under charges of heresy. A papal writ gave him pretext, but the executioner gave him power. One by one they were led to the square. Bishops, senators, merchants, beheaded in the open air, their blood washing the stones as children watched from doorways. The snow that week never turned white again. I watched from a rooftop, unable to move. 80 or more fell before the axe was stilled. Some say more. The wind carried their last prayers across rooftops, and even the crows seemed to pause in mourning. It became known as the Stockholm bloodbath, though there was no need for the name. Everyone who lived through it carried the taste of iron in their mouths for months. Christian called it justice, necessary for order. But kings who slaughter in peacetime rarely rule for long. He left Stockholm thinking fear would keep it his. Instead, it hardened the hearts of a nation. Swedish nobles who had wavered now turned to Gustav Vasa, a young rebel with fire in his eyes. Christian had killed his father in the square, and gave the son a cause to burn for. The rebellion that followed moved like flame through dry forest. Sweden rose not in frenzy, but in purpose. Peasants joined lords, and old banners were pulled from hidden chests. I rode through Dalecarlia and saw villages training boys with wooden spears. Christian sent troops to crush them, but the land itself seemed to resist. Every pass held ambush, every town a barricade. His hold crumbled faster than it had formed. In 1523, Sweden crowned Vasa as king, and the Kalmar Union shattered like old glass. Christian fled Denmark soon after, hounded by rivals, abandoned by allies. Even his own nobles turned against him, stripping him of power. He had tried to rule 3 crowns, and lost them all by his own hand. He spent the rest of his life as a prisoner, locked away by his own kin. They say he grew mad in captivity, muttering of betrayal, of justice misunderstood. I wonder if he ever thought of those he executed, if he saw their faces each time he closed his eyes. A man who gambled with lives cannot complain when fate turns cold. Christian left behind a legacy of blood and division. His ambition was not evil in itself, but his means poisoned his name. Unity, forced by fear, breeds only resistance. And once the silence breaks, even 1,000 swords cannot hush it again. Number 17, King Valdemar IV Atterdag. They called him Atterdag, meaning new day. But for many, his reign brought only darker dawns. When Valdemar rose to the throne in 1340, Denmark was fractured, lands pawned to nobles, treasury empty, crown nearly forgotten. But where others saw ruin, he saw opportunity. He reclaimed lost territories not with glory, but with gold and threat. I watched towns surrender not from war, but from weariness. He wore patience like armor. His hunger for power did not end at Denmark's borders. In 1361, he set his sights on Gotland, jewel of the Baltic, and with it, the wealthy Hanseatic town of Visby. I rode behind his army as we approached. No fanfare, no songs, only siege engines and silence. When the walls fell, there was no mercy. Visby was sacked with fury, cold as iron. Its leaders hanged, its treasures melted. I remember the church bells still ringing as smoke curled above the rooftops. After the sack, he demanded enormous tribute from the Hanseatic League. Merchants cursed his name from London to Lübeck, but he did not flinch. With silver in his hands and terror in his wake, he rebuilt Danish power stone by stone. Yet not all victories leave clean lines. Rebellion brewed behind walls too quiet. His enemies circled like wolves waiting for a wound. Within Denmark, peasants rose against his taxes. Fields once green with barley became battlefields. I saw villagers dragged from huts and beaten for coin they never held. His justice was swift, but rarely just. He crushed dissent with mailed fist, treating his subjects as obstacles rather than kin. Order returned, but it came with bruises that never healed. Valdemar knew how to wait, how to maneuver. He played kings and emperors like pieces on a board, always 10 moves ahead. But cleverness is no shield against resentment. Even those who admired his mind feared what he might do next. I once heard a noble whisper, "He builds like a mason, but rules like a hawk, always circling, always ready to strike." When his daughter Margaret married into Norway's royal house, he secured more than alliance. He planted a legacy. But legacy is not forgiveness. At his death in 1375, many praised his strength, yet none wept for the man. I saw his funeral pass, solemn and silent, the people lining the road like statues. They had feared him alive and feared his memory just as much. His rule brought Denmark back from the brink, yes, but at a cost few were willing to name. He left no poems, no songs sung in taverns, only records inked in cold hands. Power returned, but warmth did not. I've met peasants who still spit at his name beneath their breath, even generations later. That too is a form of history. Valdemar taught us that a kingdom can be reforged through iron, coin, and time, but a soul cannot. He left behind a throne polished and high, but the air around it stayed bitter. The new day he promised came, but for many it rose behind clouds. Number 18. King Eric Bloodaxe. His name alone was enough to chill a man's spine, and yet I remember him not just for blood, but for the silence that followed his passing. Eric, son of Harold Fairhair, rose to power through the blade, cutting down his own brothers to claim Norway's throne. In that age, ambition wore a crown made of grief. I heard tell of his triumphs around smoky hearths, but every tale ended with a pause, as if the bards themselves questioned whether such glory was worth the cost. He ruled briefly in Norway, and the realm did not rejoice. A king birthed from fratricide rarely walks in peace. The land did not resist him, but neither did it offer warmth. I once crossed a village road still stained from a skirmish where another of his kin had fallen. The people did not speak his name with pride. They whispered it like a warning to children who stayed out too late. Exiled from Norway, he found new footing in Northumbria, where old Norse roots clung to English soil. There he ruled again, briefly, fiercely. But peace was not his gift. I met a merchant from York who spoke of Eric's harsh levies, of halls where judgment came quickly and left wounds. He brought law, yes, but the kind that bends the knee by fear alone. The chronicles tell little of wisdom, less of justice. They speak of raids resumed under his command, of longships once more haunting English shores. Some called him a return to strength, others a shadow dragged back into the light. I walked a beach in Cumbria where burnt villages marked his path, and old women cursed the waves for bringing him. A king who returns with fire is rarely welcomed for long. In 954, his rule met its end at Stainmore, ambushed and slain. Some say it was treachery, others say it was fate. The sagas paint a grand death, sword in hand, blood on snow, but those who found his body say the wind was the only mourner that day. He died as he lived, surrounded by silence, consequence, and the weight of choices carved in steel. His legacy, like his reign, is a thing of contradiction. The sagas preserve him as a warrior, yet the people remembered a tyrant. I sat once with a skald who said, "Blood axe ruled with courage, but no love. And even the bravest axe dulls without honor." I believe he meant it kindly, but the words struck harder than intended. Not all who wear the crown know how to bear it. Eric grasped it as a weapon, not a duty. He ruled by fear, and so found no one to stand beside him when the tide turned. His sons did not avenge him. His kingdom did not endure. Only his name did, sharp, red, and echoing still. History remembers warriors, but kings must be more than warriors, or they leave nothing behind but ash. Eric bled for power and died with it in hand. Yet all the power in the world cannot warm a throne left cold by its own master. Number 19. King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia. He came to the throne with promise in his blood, son of the great Charles IV, crowned Holy Roman Emperor and King of Wisdom. But Wenceslaus inherited none of his father's strength. I lived near Prague in those years and saw how quickly reverence turned to dismay. He drank deep, trusted the wrong men, and turned from statecraft to self-indulgence. The weight of the crown seemed too heavy, yet he refused to set it down. Justice, once sacred in Bohemia, became a coin traded in taverns and alleys. Offices were sold, not earned. Laws were ignored or changed to suit the mood of the court. I watched a man hang for theft while a nobleman, guilty of worse, rode past laughing. The scales tipped with gold, not truth, and those who questioned it, imprisoned. Silenced, forgotten. Reformers began to murmur, and soon those murmurs became sermons. One voice rose above the rest. Jan Hus. A priest with fire in his words and truth on his tongue. He condemned the corruption, the sale of indulgences, the rot that spread through both church and court. Wenceslaus listened, briefly, then turned away. Easier to drink than to confront, easier to blame than to lead. Tensions worsened between the Bohemian crown and the German princes. The empire needed leadership and found none in Wenceslaus. He was deposed as king of the Romans in 1400, without battle, just forgotten. The Diet declared him unfit, and he did not protest. I remember a bishop saying, "We removed him, and he barely noticed." A ruler who shrinks from duty loses the right to command. In Prague, unrest grew. The people believed Hus spoke for them, for the soul of the nation. Wenceslaus remained distant, watching his realm fray like old cloth. When Sigismund, his brother, summoned Hus to the Council of Constance and promised safe passage, many hoped for peace. Instead, they received fire and betrayal. Hus was burned, and Bohemia erupted. I saw students riot in the streets, saw nobles withdraw their oaths, saw peasants sharpen ploughs into pikes. This was not merely political, it was spiritual. The people had been wounded, not just by flames, but by the king's silence. Wenceslaus locked himself away, more afraid of confrontation than of collapse. Some say he was mad in his final years. Others say he simply gave up. He died in 1419, as unrest turned into uprising. Windows shattered in Prague, and the Hussite Wars began not long after. His reign ended in chaos, and his memory drowned in the blood that followed. I visited his tomb once. No flowers, No prayers, only dust. It suited the man. He had ruled with absence and was remembered with the same. Wenceslaus taught me that failure is not always loud. Sometimes it comes with a yawn, a shrug, a raised cup in place of a raised sword. He lost his crown not to rebellion or invasion, but to indifference, his own and his people's. And that, perhaps, is the slowest way a kingdom dies. Number 20. King Sigismund of Hungary and Bohemia. He bore many titles: king, emperor, defender of Christendom, but the weight of them seemed to crush more than they lifted. Sigismund strode through courts and councils like a man carved for greatness. Yet behind the polished words and princely robes, there lingered the scent of broken promises. I once stood beneath his banner outside Buda and watched gold pass from hand to hand like water. He bought loyalty, but never earned it. He summoned Jan Hus to the Council of Constance, promising safe conduct under his imperial seal. That promise burned with Hus's body, and so too did any trust Bohemia had left in him. I met a student who wept in rage, holding the ashes of reform in his trembling hands. Sigismund claimed it was the council's decision, not his. But a true king does not hide behind robes of clergy when justice is betrayed. In the years that followed, the fires lit by Hus would spread across Bohemia, and Sigismund, crowned in title but not in hearts, could never put them out. Crusade after crusade failed. I watched proud knights return in disgrace, their standards tattered, their horses wounded, their spirits lower than the winter sun. The Hussites fought not with greater arms, but with purpose. And Sigismund had none left to offer. He faced enemies on all fronts: Ottomans in the south, Venice to the west, Bohemia boiling within. Each war drained more coin, and so he taxed what little remained. Towns that once thrived under free trade now shuttered, gates barred not against armies, but against their own collectors. I saw families abandon vineyards, craftsmen melt down heirlooms, priests beg beside soldiers for bread. Hunger became the emperor's herald. At court, he plotted endlessly, weaving alliances like spider's silk, only to watch them tear with the first strong wind. His charm fooled many, but not for long. Nobles laughed behind goblets, priests wrote in the margins of their missals, soldiers muttered in camps by firelight. One cannot build an empire on wit alone. And he knew it. You could see it in his eyes, the desperation behind the theatre. When he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1433, it felt like an echo of older glory. The church rang bells, the nobles dressed in silk, but the people watched in silence. I stood in the square and heard not celebration, but uncertainty. He had climbed to the top of the mountain, only to find the peak barren and cold. The empire was fractured, its spine already cracked beneath him. He died in 1437, clutching his scepter, but unable to lift it. His last days were spent among quarreling advisors and unpaid guards. No poet sang of his deeds, only scribes recorded debts and treaties. I heard his tomb was nearly looted before the lid was sealed. A fitting end, perhaps, for a man who promised much and delivered only delay. Sigismund left behind a map of borders drawn in ink, but no foundation of unity beneath them. His reign was not marked by cruelty or cowardice, but by something worse: betrayal dressed as diplomacy. He did not fall by sword or sickness, but by erosion, and when an empire erodes from the crown downward, even the strongest stone cannot hold. Number 21, Prince Vlad III, the Impaler. There are names spoken with reverence and names spoken with dread. Vlad's was the latter, even in his own time. I crossed Wallachia under his rule, and though the land was strangely orderly, it carried a silence thicker than snow. The roads were clean, crime nearly vanished, but no one smiled. Every village I passed seemed to breathe in whispers, as if louder speech might summon the man himself. His justice was not written in parchment, but in bodies. Thieves were impaled, Adulterers, spies, deserters, all met the same fate. Forests of stakes lined the roadsides, corpses swaying like grim pennants. I once saw 100 men hanging in a row, their faces frozen in agony, their souls long gone. No trial, no mercy, only order, enforced by terror. In the capital, even the dogs walked quietly. He had no patience for the Turkish threat pressing at his borders, nor for the boyars who shifted allegiance like coin. He struck at both with ferocity that stunned even his allies. When envoys refused to remove their turbans in his court, he nailed them to their skulls. The tale spread quickly, and whether it was true or not, the message was clear: submission or suffering. His hatred for treachery bordered on madness. Nobles who plotted against him found their families erased, their names forgotten. I met a mason who had built the very walls of his fortress, who said Vlad demanded precision down to the inch, or death. Yet the man praised him too. "He made us safe," he said, "at a cost." That cost, I came to learn, was borne by everyone. The people feared him, but they also feared what might come in his place. Bandits vanished under his watch, and foreign armies hesitated at the thought of facing him. In some twisted way, his cruelty brought peace. But peace soaked in blood is no comfort to the soul. The land obeyed him, but it did not love him. I remember a widow laying bread by a roadside stake as if to beg forgiveness. His fall came not from his enemies, but from too many allies disgusted by his methods. He was imprisoned, then restored, then slain in combat, his head sent to Constantinople in a sack. Even in death, he made no peace. Some say his ghost still rides the borderlands, seeking vengeance. Others say he rests easy, believing his duty fulfilled. I know only that fear lingers long after the man is gone. Legends turned him into something more than human. A monster, a vampire, a beast. But what I saw was worse. A man of flesh and will who believed that terror was the only path to order. He did not hide behind myth. He forged it with iron and agony, and walked among us like any other, only colder. Vlad left behind a kingdom too afraid to forget him. His rule was a warning, not just to enemies, but to his own people. He proved that fear could build walls, command armies, and silence doubt, but never inspire loyalty. And in the end, even the sharpest stake cannot hold a legacy upright when it is rooted in dread. Number 22. Tsar Ivan the Terrible. His childhood was shaped in silence and dread. Raised among scheming boyars after the death of his parents, young Ivan learned early that power was a shield, or a knife waiting in someone else's hand. When he became Tsar, the first of his title, he carried that suspicion like armor. I saw the Kremlin swell beneath his rule, golden domes rising as the shadows beneath them deepened. Russia grew, but so did the graves. At first, he ruled with brilliance. Laws were reformed, trade encouraged, and expansion pressed toward the east. Kazan and Astrakhan fell beneath his banners, and for a moment, the land believed greatness had come. But brilliance can crack when fear pours into it. After the death of his beloved wife Anastasia, Ivan changed. His heart did not break, it calcified. From that wound, the oprichnina was born. The oprichniki rode in black, robed like monks, yet bearing whips and axes. They were judge, jury, and executioner, loyal only to Ivan. I watched them sweep through Novgorod in 1570, and what they left behind was silence. Houses empty, wells poisoned, whole families vanished. It was not a campaign, it was a purge. The city bled for imagined treason, and the Tsar watched with cold satisfaction. He saw betrayal in every eye. Boyars were tortured, priests exiled, even his own advisors vanished without word. One could rise in his favor one morning and die by sundown. A courtier once told me he dreamed of Ivan's voice, soft and calm, before a sentence was given. He never shouted, the man whispered. That was the worst part. I never saw that courtier again. Even his family was not spared. In a fit of rage, Ivan struck his eldest son across the head with his staff, killing him. The image of that broken heir, cradled in the Tsar's arms as he wept, still haunts the frescoes. It was the moment the future of Russia faltered. I've stood in that very chamber, and the air still feels heavy, as if grief itself seeped into the stones. Toward the end, Ivan grew ever more erratic. He took new wives in haste, many against their will. He trusted no one. He surrounded himself with astrologers, relics, and whispers. His final years were filled with ritual and remorse, yet he never turned from his own shadow. When death came in 1584, it found a man drained, but still gripping the reins. His fingers had to be pried open. Russia mourned him, yet not like a father lost. It was the mourning of a storm past, relief wrapped in reverence. Some praised him as the builder of empire, the shaper of the state. Others remembered only the gallows, the fire, the men in black. I crossed villages where icons bore his likeness, and others where his name was cursed before meals. That is the legacy he left, divided, enduring, and fearful. Ivan taught the world that terror could be systematized, not just unleashed. He carved a path that others would follow, sometimes with banners, sometimes with blindfolds. He did not merely rule with fear, he perfected it. And in doing so, he became something greater than a tyrant. He became a warning. Number 23, Stefan Uroš, the weak. His father, Dušan, had built an empire that stretched like a golden cloak across the Balkans. Serbia strong, respected, feared. But when Stefan Uroš inherited the crown in 1355, it hung upon him like armor too large for his frame. I rode through those lands and saw the seams already loosening. The nobles, once held in check by the weight of Dušan's hand, now turned their eyes toward their own ambitions. And the boy who wore the crown did nothing to stop them. He was not cruel. That was the trouble. He sought harmony, and the barons took it as permission. Despots rose in Epirus, in Thessaly, in Macedonia, each carving their own fiefdoms from what had been one kingdom. I watched the imperial court grow quieter each year. Orders lost their urgency, laws were ignored, and the seal of the crown became a thing to laugh at behind closed doors. Petty lords ruled like kings, minting their own coin, raising armies not for defense, but for rivalry. Uroš would issue decrees, and they would remain unread. He visited monasteries, prayed long and earnestly, and still the empire shrank around him. I met a priest who wept when speaking of Dušan's reign, then shook his head when asked about his son. "A lamb cannot guide lions," he said, and he was right. The peasants began to suffer first, taxed by one lord, then another. Crops burned in border skirmishes between once allied states. I passed through villages where walls bore the crests of 3 rulers in a single season. Stability was a memory, and yet still, the emperor remained passive, distant, folding his hands instead of raising his voice. By the time the Ottomans pushed westward, the empire had already withered into fragments. At Kosovo in 1389, Serbian unity came too late. The battle ended in blood and legend, but no victory. I was too old to fight by then, but I stood at a hill where crows circled for days after. Uroš himself had died years before, unchallenged but also unheeded, his crown dimmed by time, not war. No monument truly honors him. His name is remembered not for deeds, but for what was lost beneath his watch. I've spoken to men who praised his gentleness, but even they confess it bore no fruit. He was not hated. He was not loved. He was merely forgotten. And in the annals of kings, that may be the cruelest judgment of all. The empire Dušan had built did not fall to foreign conquest alone. It collapsed from within, from apathy and silence, from the failure to act. I've seen towers cracked by time and rain, not war, and they remind me of Stefan Uroš, weathered not by sword, but by surrender to the slow unraveling of duty. There are rulers whose cruelty scars the earth, and rulers whose vision reshapes it. But Stefan was neither. He held greatness in his hands and watched it slip away, not from malice, not from cowardice, but from the weight of indecision. And when he died, the echoes of his father's empire faded into dust. Number 24, Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq. He ruled from Delhi with a mind sharper than most I've known. Brilliant, learned, versed in poetry, philosophy, and law. But brilliance without grounding becomes a tempest. Muhammad bin Tughlaq thought himself a visionary, and perhaps he was. Yet each vision he enacted seemed to crack the very stone it was built upon. I watched men cheer his bold proclamations, then weep beneath their consequences. Few rulers have burned so brightly, or left so much ash behind. One day, he decided to move the entire capital from Delhi to Daulatabad, hundreds of miles to the south. Not just his court, but the entire population. Families marched under the heat of 2 suns, some barefoot, some carrying the bones of their dead. Wells ran dry. Children vanished in dust storms, and when they finally arrived, parched and broken, he changed his mind and ordered the return. I saw the roads afterward, littered with silence. Then came the copper coins. He minted them by the millions, declaring them equal to silver. But without trust, money becomes metal. Counterfeiters flourished, and soon no man knew what his purse truly held. Markets collapsed. Merchants fled. I stood in Lahore and watched coins tossed into the street, worthless as pebbles. Trade died in his hands, even as he praised its virtues from his throne. His campaigns in the south were just as ruinous. The Deccan bled under forced tribute and harsh garrisons. Rebellions erupted, only to be answered with fire and impalement. I saw temples sacked not by invaders, but by imperial command. His men moved like locusts, devouring villages for the crime of resistance, or simply for standing in the way. Peace, in his empire, meant silence bought by terror. What made it worse was his unpredictability. One day, he pardoned rebels. The next, he slaughtered those who had surrendered. I met a soldier who served in his army for years. He never removed his armor, not even to sleep. Not because of the enemy, he told me, but because of the Sultan. My faith in the crown withered when loyalty could end at a gesture. And yet, in person, he could be charming, soft-spoken, intelligent, humble. He debated scholars, patronized poets, and prayed with the devout. But the same hand that gifted gold to sages also signed death warrants on a whim. He lived in contradiction and dragged the empire through it with him. I once heard a man say, "He was the wisest fool God ever made." There was pain in his voice. By the time he died in 1351, Delhi was hollowed, its coffers strained, its subjects weary. His dreams had been too vast for the earth he ruled. I returned years later and found villagers still telling stories of the march to Daulatabad, of the false coins, of the fire that fell from the sky. His rule had ended, but the confusion lingered, like smoke in stone. Muhammad bin Tughlaq taught me that vision without restraint can ruin faster than ignorance. He saw a future none could match, and when the world failed to rise with him, he broke it trying. His legacy was not evil, nor truly mad. It was ambition unanchored, and from such heights, even an empire must fall. Number 25, Caliph al-Hakim bi Amr Allah. In Cairo, the streets remember his name like an old bruise. Not fresh, but aching when pressed. Al-Hakim rose to power as a boy, and from the beginning, the city braced itself. He was a ruler of paradox, a man who could spend the morning feeding the poor and the night ordering executions. I once met a merchant who said, "He is the moon, full one day, hidden the next." That uncertainty was the pulse of his reign. He outlawed certain vegetables one week, forced night labor the next. Shoes were banned for women in public, and then allowed again months later. Candlemakers lived in fear, for he punished those who made their flames too bright. In his mind, the city was a living scripture to be rewritten daily, and in the chaos, none could rest. I remember mothers waking their children with whispers of new decrees before dawn. He built mosques, libraries, and observatories, but also sent patrols at night to spy on those walking after curfew. His presence was felt even in absence. Some say he walked the streets in disguise, judging common folk with a glance. I never saw him, but I did feel the city's breath pause each evening, waiting to see what madness the stars might spark in him that night. Then came the fire. In 1009, he ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, shocking even his allies. Christians across the world mourned, and fury spread like smoke to Europe. It was not just an act of war, it was a wound to the sacred. Pilgrims began to travel with soldiers, and whispers of holy retribution stirred the air. That single act lit embers that would blaze in future crusades. He was generous to some minorities, brutal to others. Jews and Christians were protected, then persecuted, then welcomed again, depending on the sky's mood or his own. I sat once with a scholar who had fled the Fatimid court. "He believes God speaks only to him," the man said, eyes dark. "And when God is silent, he makes up the words himself." Even within his palace, no one was safe. Viziers rose and fell with terrifying speed. Servants vanished overnight. Some were flayed in public, others drowned in the Nile. His sister, Sit al-Mulk, lived in fear, even as she grew to be one of the few steady minds near the throne. It is said she waited, watching, enduring, until the moment she could restore order. In 1021, al-Hakim disappeared during one of his nightly rides. His donkey returned alone. Some say he was murdered on her orders. Others say he fled into the desert, claiming divinity and seeking solitude. The Druze believe he never died at all, but waits to return. I cannot say what became of him, only that Cairo exhaled when he was gone. His reign was not one of conquest, but of tension, confusion, and sudden beauty. He was a ruler who built with one hand and burned with the other. And in that balance of light and fire, an empire trembled. Al-Hakim remains one of the strangest monarchs I ever witnessed, less a king than a storm wearing a crown. Number 26, King Gwangjong of Goryeo. The throne of Goryeo had long been a prize passed between clan hands like a sacred jewel, each noble polishing their share of power. But when Gwangjong took the crown in 949, he held it not as a gift, but as a weapon. I stood at court in those early years and saw a ruler who smiled like a monk but thought like a soldier. He wore mercy in his robes and steel beneath them. And soon, the kingdom would feel both. He began with grace. Freed slaves were granted names and lands. Examination systems were created to open government to merit, not blood. To some, it felt like a new age rising. I saw scribes weep with gratitude. But those who had grown fat on corruption soon learned his kindness had limits. The reforms he passed stripped them of comfort, and the axe followed close behind. Purges began quietly. Men summoned for tea were never seen again. Confessions appeared on scrolls, signed by trembling hands. I remember a general who once marched with him in youth, now dragged from his home before dawn, accused of treason none could define. The purification exams, they called them, but no one passed, only vanished, and the court grew colder by the month. His spies moved like shadows, slipping between temples and taverns. Brothers watched brothers, servants listened at doors, and even the wind in the palace gardens seemed to carry secrets. I stayed but a season before fleeing south. Too many friends of mine had simply stopped writing. In Gwangjong's Goryeo, silence became the safest prayer. He claimed to be rooting out sedition, and perhaps he was. For rebellion did sleep beneath the silks of court and the nobility had long grown bloated with inherited privilege. Yet the method consumed the meaning. Justice wielded without restraint does not purify, it scorches. And by the time he looked up from his trials, the kingdom feared him more than it followed him. Despite the blood, order grew. Roads were repaired, the army professionalized, and the realm stood more unified than it had in decades. Peasants could petition, scholars could rise, and kingship felt less like inheritance, more like destiny. But the nobility never forgot, and they waited. I saw it in their eyes, those who survived. They bowed low, but their hearts remained sharp. When Guangzhong died in 975, the court exhaled in secret. His son reversed many of his policies, but the mark had been made. Power had shown its teeth. I returned to the capital once more and found a city quieter, wiser, and wounded. His portrait still hung in the hall, but offerings were few. Respect endures, but fear does not inspire devotion. He built a stronger Goryeo, but laid its foundation in suspicion. Guangzhong was neither tyrant nor saint, but something more dangerous, a visionary who believed the end justified any means. And when a king ceases to question his own justice, even the righteous can drown in their own reflection. Number 27. King Jayavarman VIII of the Khmer Empire. Angkor once shimmered like a mirror of heaven, towers rising through jungle mist, carved with gods who smiled from every stone. I first walked its causeways when the scent of jasmine mingled with incense, and the air still carried the echoes of Buddhist chants. But when Jayavarman VIII rose to the throne, that harmony cracked. He did not share the faith of his predecessors. He saw not enlightenment in Buddha's face, but defiance, and he struck it down, piece by piece. Statues were torn from temples, their heads shattered, arms scattered like bones across palace floors. I watched monks weep as their shrines were desecrated, their scrolls burned, their prayers forbidden. In their place rose new shrines, older gods returning, Shiva with his flame, Vishnu with his wheel. The empire turned backward, not to root itself, but to erase what it had become, and those caught between were left with nothing. He taxed the people heavily, especially the temples. Stone that once held stories now bore only the weight of coin. I saw oxen collapse under loads of marble carted for new monuments, while farmers begged for grain stolen by royal collectors. There was no famine, yet hunger ruled. The people were not punished by drought, but by policy. And the gods, whichever ones remained, watched in silence. His wars with Champa bled the empire further. Jayavarman pushed south, seeking glory, but found only ash. Towns changed hands, borders shifted, and soldiers died for causes no one could name. I passed through a village near the Mekong where every house bore a different flag in a single year. Loyalty became meaningless. Survival became the only prayer worth speaking. Even within the court, unrest grew. Nobles whispered of the wealth spent on temples while roads crumbled and aqueducts cracked. The empire, once famed for its irrigation, saw fields flood or wither without warning. I walked through rice paddies abandoned to weeds and frogs, and old men cursed under their breath, never too loudly, for ears were everywhere. By the end of his reign, the splendor of Angkor remained, but it felt like a shell. Tourists and traders still marveled at the grandeur, yet inside, the empire's soul had shifted. What had once been a seat of learning and tolerance now stood as a fortress of rigid control. I returned to the Bayon and saw empty niches where Buddha once sat, now filled with blank stone. Absence was his monument. He ruled until 1295, when his own son-in-law deposed him and reversed his reforms. The old gods returned again, but the damage could not be undone so easily. Faith is delicate, like silk in rain. Once torn, even if rewoven, the threads never lie flat. The Khmer Empire would never again rise as it had before. Jayavarman VIII taught me that destruction need not come through fire or blade. It can come quietly, through decree and chisel, through the changing of a god's face, He did not burn the empire down, but he scraped away its soul. And what is a temple without its spirit, but stone in the jungle, waiting to be swallowed by time? Number 28. King Edward van Longshanks. He was a towering figure, both in height and in history, and many who met him said they felt they stood before a sword given breath. Edward ruled England with fierce purpose, and at first it seemed justice would be his legacy. I served under him in my youth, and saw laws refined, courts expanded, and barons held in check. But righteousness in a king's heart is dangerous when sharpened into conquest, and Edward's ambition cut deeper than most men dared. In Wales, he built castles like teeth into the land, Beaumaris, Caernarfon, Harlech, monuments not to peace, but to domination. The native princes fell, the language was scorned, and new laws smothered old customs. I watched a bard beaten for singing in his tongue. The land quieted under English rule, but it was not the quiet of contentment. It was the stillness after storm. Then came the expulsion of the Jews in 1290. I remember the morning it was announced. Many wept, others jeered. Synagogues shuttered, families forced to leave with only what they could carry. Gold taken, homes seized. They had lived among us for centuries, but in a breath they were strangers. Edward justified it with piety and politics, but even then, I knew it was a wound that would never heal. His wars in Scotland were no less brutal. He captured castles, shattered alliances, and hanged leaders with the cold calculation of a man who saw rebellion as contagion. I stood at Smithfield and watched William Wallace's execution, drawn, quartered, displayed as a warning. Edward saw defiance not as dissent, but as treason against order itself, and order to him was sacred. Yet despite all, he was no mad tyrant. He listened to counsel, held Parliament often, and believed deeply in justice, so long as it flowed from his own hand. His reforms shaped England for generations, but it is hard to admire the foundation when it is built atop the broken. I spoke with Scots who remembered their farms razed and kin taken. Their grief outlived him. He taxed heavily for his campaigns, and more than once I saw anger boil beneath the surface. The nobility grumbled, but none dared defy him outright, not while his will remained unbent. He governed like a blacksmith forging a blade, strong, unyielding, and willing to strike until the metal obeyed. His shadow stretched across every shire. When he died in 1307 on campaign, he ordered that his bones be carried with the army, so that even in death he would face his enemies. They say his heart beat for England until the end, and perhaps it did. But hearts can harden, and his had long turned to iron. What he built endured, but so did the resentments he left behind. Edward showed the world that greatness and cruelty can walk hand in hand. He was a king of vision and violence, of law and conquest. He gave structure to a realm, but at a cost paid by those he crushed. And history, as I've learned by firelight and field, always remembers both the sword and the scar it leaves. Number 29. King Magnus IV of Sweden, Magnus Smek. He ascended as a child, and for a brief while, Sweden dared to dream of harmony. His early reign was guided by regents, and the land held together more by habit than command. But when Magnus took full control, the weight of the crown slipped through his fingers like thawed snow. I rode through his kingdom during those years, and the roads were empty of purpose. He was not feared, not hated, only ignored. He spent lavishly on courtly pleasures, often favouring beautiful youths and eccentric projects over practical needs. Nobles watched in disdain as foreign favourites received titles and gifts, while ancient families were passed over. I attended a feast in Stockholm, where music played loud enough to drown out the sound of protest. It was the music of decline, sweet and hollow. When the Black Death came, it did not knock, it broke down the door. Whole towns vanished, and still Magnus dithered. His response was too slow, his will too uncertain. I passed through one village where only a child and an old man remained. The nobles took matters into their own hands, ignoring the crown, protecting their own lands. Unity faded into fragments. Discontent turned into open rebellion. His rule over Norway weakened, and in Sweden, the nobility grew bold. The people mocked him. Magnus Smek, they called him, snickering behind cloaks. The name clung to him like wet cloth, unwanted and unforgettable. When rulers lose respect, they lose more than armies. They lose the space in which authority can speak. Eventually, his own son turned against him, backed by German nobles hungry for power. King Albert of Mecklenburg arrived with promises in steel. Magnus fled, then returned, then was captured. I saw the banners change in Kalmar, and no one wept for the fallen king. He became a prisoner in his own land, wandering from tower to tower like a ghost still wearing his crown. His final years were spent in exile, penniless and preaching piety. He claimed visions, spoke of divine truth, but few listened. I passed him once, old and ragged, near a monastery in Norway. He looked at me as if he had once known the world and been forgotten by it. No guards, no retinue, only wind. He died in obscurity, and though the realm moved on, something fragile had broken under his watch. The authority of the monarchy, once absolute, now came with conditions. His reign showed that a king need not be cruel or foolish to ruin a kingdom, only absent when presence is needed most. The silence of leadership is louder than any war cry. Magnus left behind no victories, no reforms, no legacy of greatness, only the memory of what was lost while he looked away. He ruled not with tyranny, but with neglect, and that, I learned, can be just as fatal to a nation's soul. A crown must weigh heavy, or it means nothing at all. Number 30. King Charles IX of France. He ruled during a time when France bled from within. One kingdom, many swords, and too much fire. Charles was young, uncertain, and surrounded by voices louder than his own. His mother, Catherine de' Medici, guided his hand with a grip of iron wrapped in silk. I stood near the Louvre gates the day he was crowned, and already the tension crackled in the air like a coming storm. France did not want a child, but it got one. At first, he sought peace between Catholic and Huguenot, desperate to mend what decades of religious hatred had torn apart. The Edict of Saint-Germain was his olive branch, and for a moment the streets quieted. But peace made on parchment often dies in alleys. Beneath the smiles at court, blades were being sharpened. Trust did not bloom. It withered, poisoned by whispers. The marriage of his sister Margot to Henry of Navarre was meant to seal the unity. A Catholic princess and a Protestant prince, one house at last. But the wedding brought not peace, but a target. I was in Paris in August of 1572, and the fear in the air was thicker than incense. That night, the bells rang not for celebration, but for slaughter. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre began with Admiral Coligny and did not stop for days. Huguenots were dragged from beds, cut down in churches, butchered in cellars. The Seine ran red. I helped bury the dead behind Saint-Germain. Children, artisans, soldiers, all cast into one pit. Some say Charles ordered it. Others say he only gave permission once the killing had begun. But the blood was on his hands either way. He wept after the carnage, fell ill, and never truly recovered. I heard him speak once in a chapel, pale and hollow, saying God would never forgive him. The walls seemed to lean in at those words. His mind began to unravel. Visions, fevers, fits of rage. He trusted no one, not even himself. The weight of the crown pressed harder with each passing month. France did not calm. The wars continued, each more bitter than the last. Protestant and Catholic armies carved the land like a shared carcass. And Charles, once boy king, now wandered palace corridors like a ghost. Even the throne room felt empty with him seated in it. He ruled, But the kingdom moved without him, blood guiding the tide more than any law. When he died in 1574, coughing blood into silk, few mourned with sincerity. He left behind a country fractured, faith poisoned, and a legacy drowned in suspicion. His brother Henry inherited more conflict than crown. And France, long proud and radiant, now staggered like a drunkard, searching for clarity in a shattered chalice. Charles taught me that indecision can be as deadly as cruelty. He was not born a monster, nor shaped into one, but history cares little for intent when the dead are uncountable. Sometimes, a king's failure lies not in action, but in the silence before the blade falls. And that silence still echoes in the walls of Paris. And so, the fire grows low, dear traveller. And I have told you of kings, some born into madness, others forged by ambition, and many undone by silence or fear. You have walked with me through bloodied streets, past scorched palaces, and into courts where mercy held no seat. These were not tales of legend, but memories carved into the bones of history. Men who wore crowns, not as symbols of grace, but as burdens too heavy for the soul. Power, when wielded without wisdom, turns not into glory, but shadow. Now, only the crackle of embers keeps us company, and the stars overhead remain unmoved. Perhaps you carry questions. Perhaps your heart feels the weight of what rulers leave behind. Let them stir in silence. Let them pass like smoke into the night. I am the lonely night, and my watch is long. But you, rest now. May your dreams be gentler than the truths I've spoken. And when you wake, may you walk your own path with eyes open and your crown